Gloria, thank you for the introduction. And she's right. I was eager to come down here and talk to you for a number of reasons. And you're going to kind of hear the craziness that I've been up to. But I've looked at a whole lot of things over my 47 years. And I see the world as being at a very great transition point. We're at a place, and there's obviously, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we're in a place that we've never been close to anything like this before in human history. And I'm going to ask a favor of you. I've never done this before, but I kind of had it in the back of my head to do this, and because I'm going to be kind of short on time, and quite frankly, I'm a little bit nervous because you are a very well-educated group. You are my target audience because the stuff that I've been studying consciousness for the first 15, 17 years I studied, I couldn't find a single person I could have a conversation with about. And now I can walk into these chapters of ions. I don't have to simplify it. I don't have to cut it back. I don't have to dial it down. I can give it to you straight and you understand it and you're right there with me on the same page. So it is a privilege to me to get to speak to a group like you, which is why I was so eager to come down here. It's an honor. And I think we're at a very pivotal point in history, and I'm going to go over why that is, and I think this group is literally the key in the keyhole. I think y'all are the tip of the spear, and I'm going to go into that more later. But what I'm going to ask you to do, because frankly I'm a little bit nervous, it's not what I'm going to say, it's what I'm not going to get to say. It's what I'm going to have to leave out in the time that we've got. Because consciousness, anybody that's taken 30 seconds to really think about it, is an extremely broad subject. It touches virtually everything in our lives. So I could go on for days and days, but I don't have days and days. So I'm going to have to try really hard to get to you the most important thing. You've honored me by sharing your time and your attention with me. I want to honor you by giving you something of value tonight. That's my aspiration. That's my goal. So what I would like for you to do, if you would, I want you to raise your hands, send energy up this way, just kind of release your higher self, shoot your energy up at me, and I'm going to kind of energetically, quickly meet everybody in the group, and hopefully that will be able to help me tailor what I speak on. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay. I'm going to start. I get from that, I'm going to throw in something I hadn't really intended to talk about, but I will. First, I want to talk about Stacy. I started a group in Dallas-Fort Worth. It was a meetup group called the Consciousness Project. Stacy twisted my arm and made me start it. She's like, you know some interesting things. You're reasonably entertaining. You make people laugh, usually not intentionally, but you know, you're always good for a joke. So you should start this group. And so her and one other lady friend of mine were instrumental in getting me to do that. So I started this group. It was called the Consciousness Project, and our goal was to come together in a very non-judgmental, non-threatening environment and discuss the kinds of things that you can't discuss around the water cooler. To have these, pool our common experiences of being the outcast, of not being understood by people, and as soon as you get into something that you see as important and relevant to the world, people start rolling their eyes and saying, what time's the football game? And tuning you out. So we wanted to create a place and a space to go. So she twisted my arm. I started this group, and within a year, I think we had over 200 members in DFW, and people were coming and people were listening. Well, one of the wonderful things about that group, it helped me tremendously. A lot of my ability to write that book is because of hundreds and hundreds of conversations I had had with people in that group. And we had people that were atheist, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, came from all different walks of life. And we pooled our experiences, we pooled our views, and we had this experience of conversation, of discussing some of these deeper issues. And because of this group, I was able to really tailor what it was I was saying in a way that people understood, because I had been taught by so many different people from so many different walks of life what can be heard, what can be universally heard. So it helped me tremendously in being able to communicate this. So I owe Stacy a big debt of gratitude for moving me in that direction. But in terms of the big picture, I kind of want to start with the big picture on consciousness and Stacey, would you mind handing me one of those books, please? I want to start with the really big picture. This is what I wasn't going to talk about, but I will. In this book, it's, I don't know, 20 years. I was reading the Upanishads, Plato, studying Buddhism, Hinduism, all that stuff in high school. That's how long I've been working on this. To me, I think where we are in history, the pivotal point is what's happening with the collective consciousness. We can look at this metaphorically. We know how the human brain works. We know that it's made up of a bunch of brain cells, and then there's the synapses that connect those brain cells. And biology's taught us that what makes the brain work, where it gets its power, is these synaptic connections. And it is the transfer of electronic signal between the cells in these synaptic connections. That's the engine, the power of the brain. That's where our thoughts are created. That's where our memories are stored. That is the horsepower behind how the brain works. Well, if you look at humanity, and you look at each human being as a cell in a global brain, and you look at the internet as synaptic connections between those cells, the horsepower of the collective consciousness is growing exponentially. Okay? So from the standpoint of the collective consciousness, we have the birth of a new creature we have never seen before. And it's operating at a power collectively that the earth has never seen anything close to like it before. And it's going to change and reorder human society. I think all of y'all have already keyed into that. I'm not telling you anything new. But where I try and focus is, okay, how do we integrate? How do we interface between us as individuals and the collective consciousness? How do we tune into it? How do we communicate with it? How do we recognize the oneness that essentially we all are? And I kind of realized, and I think it was about the time I was wrapping up, putting the structure of the book together, I kind of realized that we had hit on something in this group that Stacey had helped me start. When I went to a meeting, I was invited by somebody. They said, hey, we've got this group of people. We talk about spiritual stuff. We'd like for you to come down and talk to us. So I go down and I talk to them. And I went around the group. There was, I think, about 30 people in the room. And I said, if you could have one question in life answered, any one question you want, what would that question be? And they thought about it for about 5 minutes. And then we went around the room and everybody said what their question was. Well, out of 30 people, when you really cut down to what they were truly asking, 29 people asked the same question. Okay? So we started getting into this, and we started talking about it, and we used language of consciousness, the verbiage and the terminology of consciousness, as our language for discussion. And it is a very well-suited tool for that because, one, it has no historical, ideological, or cultural affiliations or allegiances. We've seen it. We've seen discussions of consciousness in virtually every culture that has existed. So it removes the politics. It is the Esperanto, the universal language. If you talk in terms of consciousness, you can walk up to a fundamental Christian and you can have a conversation with them about metaphysical stuff, and they can get where you're coming from. You can also walk up to an atheist and talk about metaphysical stuff and use the language of consciousness, and they can understand where you're coming from. It's kind of intuitively understood by most human beings, and it makes for a good translation tool. Well, what happened in this room as we went around and I heard people talk about their questions and who they were and where they were from, we got done, we got to the end of it, and we had these very deep, frank discussions about, the meaning of life and what it meant for each of us and how we tried to roll that out in our day-to-day experiences. And we got done, and there was a guy at the end, he said, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. He said, I'm Jewish. That guy right there is Muslim. These two are Catholic. This lady's Wiccan. That dude over there, and I think this girl are pagan. And there's three over here. I have no idea what they are. But we have talked about this stuff. We've poured out our hearts. We have not had a cross word. It's been like family discussing this, and I was like, okay, we're on to something now. Because if we're looking at the collective consciousness, and if we're looking at moving humanity forward, it's all about our ability to interact together, to cross-pollinate, to share, to learn from each other, to help each other instead of beat each other over the head with the bricks. I'm not telling y'all anything you don't know. But what's new and what's amazing is the technology and the ways we have of approaching this. We're coming up with some new ways that are really being helpful. So, with all that being said, this book, The Consciousness Paradigm, what is it about? Since y'all are very rational, scientifically minded people, I'll just cut to the chase and tell you in a nutshell, it's about magic. People who operate at higher levels of consciousness are magical beings. They live magical lives. They have magical experiences, and they do magic on a day-to-day basis. It's the craziest thing. How can I say that? Here's how I can say it. Arthur Clarke tells us, or has told us, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you took a cigarette lighter and you got teleported back to caveman days, they would think you were an offspring of the gods. Or you were doing voodoo or something, really naughty. Very simple technology, but to the people that don't understand it, it seems to be magic. Well, it's the same thing with consciousness. People who operate at higher levels of consciousness, their lives appear as magical to people who don't understand what they're doing. People who don't understand the techniques they're employing, the structures that they're using, the way they are using their mind to create their daily experience. It seems like magic. They just happen to have all these synchronicities fall into place. They just happen to meet the right person at the right time. They just happen to have avoided that huge debacle that everybody else walked right into. Time and time again, they keep doing it. It seems like magic, but it's not. It's really a very simple technology. It's just not understood. So we're going to dig into that. Consciousness. A pretty good definition of consciousness is the capacity of a system to respond to stimuli. What does that mean? If you translate that into practical terms, what that means is the mind's ability to interact with its environment and create for you the life that you want. That's what we're talking about with consciousness. Why did I write this book, The Consciousness Paradigm? It all started a long, long time ago. When I was young, I think it was probably somewhere around 6th grade, I started thinking about life in the world and why was I here and why were we all here and what were we doing and what were we supposed to be doing. And I noticed some things about the world I didn't like. There were kids in Africa that were starving. Hadn't done anything to anybody, but they were not going to wake up the next morning because they didn't have enough food to eat. There were a lot of women that got beat to a pulp by their husbands. There were children that were abused and neglected. A lot of very nasty, horrible things going on in the world. I was raised in the Methodist Church, and I began to question, well, how could this God that I've been taught to believe in, how could he allow that to happen? And how could this be the way it is? And I kept getting more hurt and more frustrated and more hurt until one day I woke up and I was in a pretty deep depression. I was like, oh, this isn't good. And as Gloria mentioned, I grew up in Tyler. I couldn't have a discussion with anybody about any of this stuff. Well, Patanjali says that if you do this, and they're like, I think you need to go get exercise, son. Go down to the priest and get fixed. You got a problem. Or, go to the funny farm. So I didn't have anybody I could talk to. So all I had was books. And I read, and I read, and I read. I read the philosophers. I studied religion, spirituality, psychology, the occult, physics, metaphysics, on and on and on. And after a while, I started learning some things. I learned there are certain things that you can do with your mind, and if you do them, they're almost guaranteed to cause you pain. Not good mental habits. And I was like, I'm going to try changing that. So I tried changing it in my mind. And what do you know? Things got a little bit better. And I was like, well, that's very interesting. It was in my head. Let me try that with this over here. So I changed another way that my mind was thinking, and that got better. And I was like, well, that's very interesting. So I kept trying this, and my world, my external world, kept getting better and better, when really it was just my mind and the way my mind was projecting onto reality and interpreting reality and my interaction with it. And I realized, from the external world, I had no reason to be depressed at all. I had a very good life. Solid middle class. I had everything I want. Everything was going wonderfully. I had no problems. I just happened to be very, very unhappy. And I realized, all of this I've created in my own mind. And after working on this, after about 6 months, I worked my way out of depression. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I just changed the way I think, and I can get rid of all this negative stuff that was in my world. I was like, what if I go beyond that? And I try and change the way I think to create more positive stuff and make a better life. And I tried that, and oddly enough, that worked too. I thought, well, this is pretty cool stuff. Well, not knowing exactly what to do with that beyond myself, I thought, okay, well, now I'm out of high school. I'm faced with making a living. I've got to do something. And I go through college and wind up as a lawyer. And I practice family law. And family law is a virtual laboratory for seeing everything that can go wrong in relationships. And I saw it again and again. And I would try talking to my clients, and I'd say, if you would change the way that you're thinking about this, it could really improve your experience of life. And all of a sudden, they would go on the defensive. They'd feel like I was attacking them instead of being their advocate because it was too painful to look inside, which is the only place they were ever really going to improve their lives. And this happened again and again and again and again, and I finally realized, if I want to help people, I've got to give them the tools and the solutions before the hurricane hits. Because if you're in the middle of the hurricane and you're trying to raise your consciousness, that is a very difficult undertaking. So I started working on the book. But time and time again, I saw this scenario, and it was a lot like Philo and Boudreaux going coon hunting. Philo and Boudreaux go coon hunting one night, and it is late at night. There's just a sliver of a moon. It's overcast. You can't even see any stars. It is almost pitch black. So they're out there with their lanterns and their dogs and their guns, and they're running through the woods. And finally the dogs pick up a scent. And they follow this scent, and they can hear the dogs barking and everything. And they finally get this coon up a tree. And Philo and Boudreaux walk up to the tree. And Philo says, "Boudreaux, shoot that coon." And Boudreaux said, I can't see it. It's too dark. And Philo says, "I tell you what. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to climb that tree. I'm going to knock that coon out, and when he hits the ground, because it'll be close to your lantern, you shoot him." Boudreaux said, "I'm going to do that." So Philo starts shimmying up that tree. And about 30 seconds later, Boudreaux hears all this screaming and hollering and hissing and howling. And Philo starts screaming, "Shoot, Boudreaux, shoot!" And Boudreaux said, "I can't shoot. I can't see anything." And Philo said, "There's a bobcat up here. Shoot!" And Boudreaux said, "I can't shoot. I can't see. I might hit you." And Philo said, "Well, shoot anyway. One of us has got to have some relief." And I kept seeing these people in life that were up the tree with the bobcat, and they didn't know how they got there, and they didn't know how to get down. So consciousness and learning how to use it to create the life we want is learning how to not go up the tree with the bobcat in it, and instead use that time and energy to provide us with things that we actually do want, that will enrich us. So what we're talking about is how do we use the mind to get less of what we don't want and more of what we do want. So this book, The Consciousness Paradigm. What's it about? Consciousness, but it's also a book about you. And I'm going to explain that to you in a little more detail later. But remember I said that. It's a book about you. So first I want to ask you 2 questions. What is the purpose of your life? And where's your life going? How many of you are clear on the answers to those 2 questions? Got a few. Got a few. Okay. In a minute, I'm going to introduce you to somebody that's going to have a lot to say about those 2 questions as it relates to you. But first, here's what I would like for you to do. We're going to do a very brief experiment. It's going to take 2 minutes. What I want you to do, I want everybody to be still, be quiet, close your eyes, and for 2 minutes, I want you to absolutely quiet your mind and do not think about a single thing. Do not have a single thought go through your head, okay? 2 minutes. It's going to be real easy. All right? I will tell you when 2 minutes is up, but between now and then, I want you to make sure you don't have a single thought go through your head. All right, ready, set, go. Okay, that's 2 minutes. Real easy, wasn't it? How many of you were successful in not having a single thought go through your head? Nobody. All right, what just happened there? I just introduced you to you. What you heard, all those thoughts that came up in your mind, those are unassimilated parts of your mind that have not been yet assimilated into your conscious awareness. There are parts of you that you haven't gained full access and control to. Okay? Life is a process, and the reason I took you through that exercise is it's going to become more apparent later, but a whole lot of where we're going has to do with that part of you that you just met. And if you're normal, all those thoughts that you just encountered, you just scratched the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more beneath that. Whole lot more beneath that. Life is a process. If we look at life, if we try and say, let's wrestle this animal to the ground and figure out what is it really? What's the essence of life? Okay? Most people, the process of life is each day they take food, vegetables or fruits that have been grown from the sunlight. They convert the energy of the sunlight into fruit or vegetables or animals that have eaten those fruits and vegetables. They eat that food, which produces energy in their body. They take that energy and they convert it to work. For their labors, they get paid, with which they pay the bills that they have to pay in order to survive. And then with what's left over, they invest some of it and they spend some of it on what they believe will make them happy. Whether they're investing it for their future security or whether they're investing it in activities or things that they think will make them happy. Ultimately, with the remainder, they're spending it to make themselves happy. So if we look at the very basics of this equation, what it really boils down to is life is a process of converting energy into happiness. Everybody's got a different idea of what happiness looks like, of what package it comes in, of how you get there. But the basic thing going on with life is us converting energy into happiness. And it's the mind that makes that conversion. The mind is the machine that makes that transfer. So if we really want to master this process of life, we want to figure out how do we make our mind more effective at doing this conversion? How do we make it more effective and more efficient? That is the challenge of using consciousness constructively. There's two key principles. Most of you have probably already started looking through these lenses, but principle number one, energy is a resource. Everybody's familiar with that in a macro level. We got to have gas in the car. We got to heat our houses, all that kind of stuff. But for this discussion, I want us to shift our focus one level deeper and consider this. Subtle energy is the Holy Grail. And by subtle energy, I mean the energy that is moving through your mind that manifests as the thoughts that you have and the actions that you take and the beliefs that you hold. Okay? So as we go through this discussion, think of it in those terms. What's happening in the mind? What's happening with the flow of energy as it goes from a raw state until it manifests as something in our lives, whether it's an idea, an action, or a belief? Okay. Consciousness and insight. Insight is a really big benefit that we get from raising consciousness. And what I want to propose is a structure for looking at this. I'm not saying that this is the correct way to look at it, but I am telling you it is a very useful tool for looking at this, and it's an extremely useful tool for having conversations. If you're trying to discuss this with somebody who comes from a different school of origin philosophically or who has no clue what you're talking about, this is a very simple way of trying to diagram some very subtle, abstract concepts. Consciousness and insight. Consciousness within the... for this discussion, I'm going to talk about the human experience. If you look at consciousness, the most simple form that we know as the human experience is the very constricted point of consciousness which manifests as full-on ego, like a child. Okay? The only thing that consciousness knows is what it wants. And an infant is a good example. I'm hungry, feed me. I'm scared, comfort me. I'm wet, change my diaper. No concept of its environment and how it's impacting its environment or the other people in its environment. All it knows is what it wants. It sees the world solely from its perspective. But as consciousness begins to grow and expand, it gets more sophisticated. And this kid gets old enough, he has the realization, if I bite Mommy's finger, Mommy's going to get mad at me. He's beginning to have a realization that he's impacting his environment. The kid gets a little older, gets a little more sophisticated, and he recognizes, if I go out on the playground and I call this other kid a bad name, he may not like me because I don't like it when I get called a bad name. Well, in very simple terms, that kid's consciousness has just doubled. Because now he's processing the world or the situation from two perspectives, his own and the target of his actions. Okay? This kid grows a little more, his consciousness develops a little bit more, expands a bit further, and he has the realization one day, if I'm out on the playground and I punch this kid in the nose, this other kid may see me do it and may not like me, may think I'm a bully because of what I did. Well, in very simple terms, that kid's consciousness has just tripled. Because now he's processing reality from three perspectives. His own, the target of his actions, and an independent third-party observer of that interaction. Okay? So you all see the pattern that's going on here, right? What happens as consciousness evolves, we all start out here being born as infants with this very constricted ego point of consciousness. It's all about me. But as consciousness evolves, the number of perspectives that it can take into account and that it utilizes in processing its perspective of reality expands. It gets broader and broader. And this process continues and continues until eventually you get all the way to what we call universal consciousness or enlightenment. There's all kinds of names for it. But at this point, at universal consciousness, theoretically, every perspective that exists holds value for that consciousness. And to some extent, it will try and account for it. It'll take a very universal perspective of its place within reality. But for that consciousness, every perspective holds value. Okay. What this means is, as consciousness evolves and grows up, the number of perspectives it utilizes and can utilize increases. Okay? That means it has greater insight. It's like the three blind men and the elephant. Four blind men and an elephant. The first three are in front, there's one in back, and they walk up to an elephant, and the first one grabs its tail, and it says, "This feels like a rope. We must have walked under a tent." The second blind man has walked into the side of the elephant, and he said, "No. It feels like a wall. We've walked into a building." And the third blind man has walked into the elephant's leg and says, "No, it feels like a tree trunk. We've walked into the forest." And they proceed to argue for 20 minutes over whether they're in a forest, up against a building, or under a tent. And finally, the fourth blind man thinks about what all three of them had said and said, the only thing I know that fits all three of those things is an elephant. He utilized more perspectives and he had deeper insight. That's what consciousness does for us. If you have more insight and you see more options, you see more perspectives, that gives you more possibilities. I'll give you an example as a metaphor for life. A kid and his dad are driving down the highway late at night. They get a flat tire. It's actually several hours after this picture. It's very dark. They can't see anything. They pull over. Dad gets out. He takes all the lug nuts off the hubcap, off the tire, puts them in the hubcap beside the car. He pulls the flat tire off. As he's going around to get the spare out of the trunk, he kicks the hubcap, and all his lug nuts go flying out in the field. They don't have a flashlight. It's too dark to see anything. Him and the kid look for 15 minutes, can't find a single lug nut. Finally, Dad says, "Okay, well, we're in a pickle here. Let's start walking for town." And The kid says, well, Dad, why don't we just take one lug nut off of each of the other wheels, and that'll hold us on until we can get into a gas station. On the road of life, Dad was stuck because he ran out of options. But the kid could keep going because he saw options the father didn't see. That's what higher consciousness does for us. And I'm going to go into more detail about how and why that occurs. But in essence, that's what we're looking at. Okay, this thing that I just talked about, I'm going to talk about the same thing, but I'm going to slice the pie a little bit differently. I'm going to take this whole thing and draw it as a bar. So when I go to this bar, just remember single point of consciousness down here, universal consciousness up here. Consciousness is a lot like light. You can compare it to light. When you look at light, typically it'll be white. But if you run it through a prism and break it down, you'll see all these different colors, red, green, yellow, orange, and blue, that were within that white light. But they were bands within the spectrum. Same thing with consciousness. This is actually a spectrum. But for purposes of discussion, we can break that spectrum into sections. Okay? And what we've seen, and this is I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but this is a near universal description of consciousness. Almost every culture that's been looked at that has studied consciousness in depth has seen these milestones and described them similarly. If you get behind the language, the essence of what they describe is very similar. Okay, we start out here at the bottom level as babies, and we're born at the instinctual level. And as we progress up, the world, reality, looks markedly different to each of these levels of consciousness. If you're here, it's going to look different to you than it does to people down here and up here. Okay? They're literally in 7 different worlds. What do those worlds look like? At the instinctual level, the basic level that we all start out with, consciousness sees itself as a body with immediate needs. I got to survive until tomorrow. It's not much more than the survival instinct. And then as that gets taken care of and consciousness expands, it moves up a level. And what we have learned is we, as the human species, routinely go through these step by step. It's just like grades in school. You got to master first grade before you move up to second grade. And you got to master second grade before you move up to third grade. Okay? You can't just jump levels. We progress up them one at a time, mastering each one. So each level acts as a foundation for and a doorway to the next. On average, people who are progressing, it takes 7 years to go up one level of consciousness. Okay, so consciousness masters this one, moves up to this level. It begins to see itself as a body needing to secure its future needs. Okay, I'm probably going to live to see tomorrow. I'm probably going to be here in a few months, a few years. I'm going to have needs then just like I do now. I'm going to need to eat. I'm going to need a place to live, etc., etc. So it starts looking to secure its security and its future. Once consciousness develops beyond that and goes up to the next level, it begins to expand itself beyond the solo view. It begins to see itself as a member of a tribe. And that tribe can be any identifiable human group. It can be a religious group. It can be a socioeconomic class. It can be a political party. It can be any identifiable, it can be a family group, a clan. It can be any identifiable group of human beings that consciousness takes on as a critical part of its identity. When consciousness evolves up to the next level, the rational level, it begins to see itself as a body with beliefs and ideas and thoughts and principles. It's beginning to move into the abstract now. You can see how its concept of what it is growing and getting bigger, and including broader and more abstract layers. Then when it evolves again, it moves up to the pluralistic level, and it sees itself as one of countless invaluable souls. For lack of a better word, we'll just use souls. It kind of has a generic meaning. And then when it progresses beyond that, at the integral level, consciousness sees itself as an integral part of a grand design, of this huge, elegant machine of which it plays an important role, and in which it is beautifully integrated. And then when consciousness evolves beyond that up to universal consciousness or enlightenment, consciousness tends to see all of reality as one organic whole expressing itself in limitless ways. So it's a oneness mentality. Okay. There's been quite a bit of research, mostly in the field of spiral dynamics, about where, if you look at the world, you try and divide it up on this pie, where do we sit as the human family? And what they've come up with, if you add these up, they're going to be a little bit more than 100 because some people were on the cusp and got counted in two categories. But it gives you a pretty good idea of how we stack up. About 10% of the world is living at the instinctual level. Life is do or die for them. About 20% at the individualistic level. 40%, the center of mass, is at the conformist level, a tribal mentality. My country, right or wrong. My religion. All the others are going and can go to hell, etc., etc. 30% of the world is functioning at a rational level. Okay? For them, when consciousness begins to interact with the world that way, it becomes a chess game. It's all about making the right decisions, doing the right things, making the correct strategic moves so that your future will come out the way you want it to. Pluralistic level, 10% of the world. And when you get up here to integral and transcendent, you're talking about 1% of the world's population. It's very significant. I'm going to come back to that more in a minute. All right. I want to give you one example as a demonstration of how differently the world looks at each of these levels. And this is only one example. It rolls out in countless different ways. But I'm going to talk about morality. Right and wrong, morality, good and bad, look very differently depending on which level of consciousness it's being viewed from. At the instinctual level, the moral imperative is survival. You do whatever you got to do to survive to see tomorrow, because if you don't, the species gets wiped out. Okay? Survival of the fittest, baby. If you have to steal something to live to see tomorrow, you steal it. If you have to kill somebody to survive to see tomorrow, you kill them. That's what you're supposed to do because your moral obligation is to survive. At the individualistic level, it becomes a little more nuanced. And the moral imperative becomes security. What is right and wrong, what is good and bad, is determined by whether it will make that consciousness more or less secure. Am I more likely to get my property stolen if I go this route? If so, that's bad. If not, that's good. At the conformist level, right and wrong in morality is determined by tribal custom. What would my tribe say? If my tribe says it's good, it's good. If my tribe says it's bad, it's bad. Very strong reliance on customs and social mores. At the rational level, morality, right and wrong, good and bad, are based on justice and fairness. The consideration is becoming more abstract. It's becoming more universally applicable. Is the course of action that I'm contemplating taking, is it just? Is it fair? If so, it's good. If not, it's bad. At the pluralistic level, the moral standard is love. Is what I'm thinking about doing coming from a place of love, or is it coming from hatred? At the integral level, the moral imperative is the greatest good. What will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people over the greatest period of time. And at the transcendent level of consciousness, the moral standard is the evolution of life. Is what's going on contributing to the evolution of life itself. So, if you think of consciousness and you think of these levels of consciousness, you can think of each level like a tool. It's like a tool in a toolbox. I've just arbitrarily assigned different tools to each level. There is a misconception about consciousness. There's many, but one of the most common is higher consciousness is always better. That is not true. The best level of consciousness is the one that most effectively addresses the situation with which you're faced. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got a guy up here who's functioning at his preferred level is the integral level of consciousness. And he's walking through the forest contemplating the marvelous vicissitudes of nature and the beauty of the biodiversity that he's surrounded by. And he comes around the corner and there's a bear. Well, he can sit there and he can think about where exactly the bear fits in the web of life. He's probably going to be lunch before he gets done with that analysis. Okay? If he wants to survive, well, he darn well better drop it down in first gear and run, climb, or fight like he's never run, climbed, or fought before. Okay? As a lawyer, this is the optimal level for me to function at. Imagine, I'm a lawyer, a lady comes in, she says, my husband just served me with divorce papers, and I respond from the instinctual level, well, he's trying to take everything you've got. Let's go get Moose and Guido, fit him with some cement tennis shoes, and send him swimming. Okay? Number one, I'm probably going to be in prison pretty quickly, if not dead. And number two, she's going to go running, screaming out the door. On the other hand, if I go in this direction and I respond to it from a transcendent level, I say, in 200 years, nobody's even going to know the difference. What are you so uptight about? There she goes, right out the door again. The requirements of what I do as a lawyer require me to function at this level. So, again, back to the myth. Higher consciousness is not always better. The best level of consciousness is the one that most effectively addresses the situation with which you're faced. Okay. So if you look at this and you think about this like a carpenter's toolbox, the more tools you can use, the more effective a structure you can build. The sounder, the more elegant, and the more effective, better all the way around, the more tools that you can use. And we've all heard the old saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay? And if all you've got is a hammer, boy, I'm probably not going to want to stay in your house when you get done with it. All right. So what we see is as we progress up this ladder of consciousness, as we progress up these levels of consciousness, what we get is more tools. The higher up you go, the more tools you have access to. And we can kind of redraw that so that it looks like this. The higher you are in terms of consciousness, the higher you've progressed, the broader your situational awareness and the greater your response capabilities. There is a very significant line that happens in the progression of consciousness. Very significant hurdle. Okay? It is so significant that I say that the people who've made it over this hurdle from a consciousness perspective are turbocharged. They're operating on high octane, and here's why. There's been a lot of research on this, and what we have found is that these first 5 levels of consciousness, which I call the competitive range, there is an inherent assumption with each of them that they are correct. They are the best. Therefore, the other levels are somehow deficient, defective, or flat out wrong. You take somebody who functions at the rational level, they'll look at somebody who's primarily at the pluralistic level and say, well, they've just got their head in the clouds. They're not realistic. They're not connected to reality. They're not living in the world as it is. You take somebody who's primarily at the pluralistic level, coming from a place of love, and they look at someone in the rational level and say, well, they're just cold and calculating. They're not really connected to what life is all about. Okay? Each of these levels, consciousness at each of these levels tends to assume that it is correct, that its tool is the best tool for whatever the job may be. But when consciousness jumps this hurdle, there's a big quantum shift in its perspective. Once it reaches the integral level, when it does, consciousness looks back and says, you know what? Every single one of these is important. If we as a species were missing any one of them, we'd be in for some serious trouble. They all play a critical role. They are all very important. So from the integral level of consciousness up, consciousness recognizes the value of every level, which means it makes it much easier for it to switch tools. It's not stuck thinking that the tool it has is automatically the best one. It is much better equipped and more objective in seeing which is the best tool for the job and it makes it easier for it to switch tools. So if you look at that as progressing through life, basically what happens down here is quicksand. You better hope what you run into is a nail if all you've got is a hammer, or if you're thinking that the hammer is the only tool you should use. Whereas if you're up here, it doesn't matter what you run into, you can very easily shift gears and pick up the tool that's best suited for that particular situation, deal with it, move on to the next. So what we see is that in life, higher consciousness provides greater agility and effectiveness. You can hop levels much more fluidly. And you're more effective because you're much more likely to pick up the right tool and recognize what the best tool is in the first place. Okay, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think we're all familiar with this. Well, not surprisingly, this mountain of needs that we all have to climb, well, I'm going to back up a little bit. Maslow, just make sure we're all on the same page here. Maslow says basically, we all have to go up this mountain of needs. It's what we have to do as humans to carry on to the next day. But from his perspective, pay dirt really happens when you get up here to self-actualization. He described self-actualization as the peak experiences of being human. That is when we are at the height of our capacity and life is the most fulfilling for us. So the goal, the promised land, the gold mine is making it up here to self-actualization. When you're living in self-actualization, you are living life with all pistons firing. Okay. Not surprisingly, the hierarchy of needs is very consistent with the levels of consciousness, and I'm sure many of you probably already recognize the harmony between them. That's because this structure is near universal. Almost everybody that's looked at it has seen that. Maslow's is just one interpretation of it. Okay. To get up this mountain of needs, to get up to self-actualization, here's how most people go at it. Or I shouldn't say most, I should say many. Here's how many people go at it. It's what I call the path of conquest. If you want something, if you want to have a life of abundance, you go to work, you make money, you become successful at what you do, you develop a good reputation, you become well known, people start seeking you out, you make a lot of money, you take that money, you buy your island over by Tahiti, you move there, you retire, you settle down, you have a good life. You go out, you exert yourself, you overcome your environment until you can take from it what you want. That's the path of conquest. There is another path, which is the path of transformation. This is the path that you typically see amongst religious and spiritual approaches. And that says, rather than go out and take what I need from my environment, rather than overcome it, I'm going to change my assumptions about what it is that I need. I'll give you a very extreme example that illustrates the point. If you have somebody who is paranoid schizophrenic, they're going to have huge issues right here in the safety level. And according to Maslow, and this is a very oversimplified statement, but according to Maslow, they're going to be stuck here. They're never really going to get to real, meaningful, lasting relationships because they're going to spend all their time trying to feel safe because they feel like everybody's out to get them. So their progression kind of stops right here. They never even get a chance to work on self-actualization. They're spending all their time and energy trying to feel safe. Well, if you could snap your fingers and cure them from their paranoid schizophrenia, all of a sudden, with a modest job in a reasonably safe neighborhood, they can probably take care of those needs and start moving on to the next ones. Okay? So what is happening is by changing the way the mind thinks, the beliefs that it holds, the assumptions about what it has to have, if you use the path of transformation, you're taking the top of the mountain and bringing it down to you. Rather than climbing a big mountain, you're shrinking it. There's a story about a guy who was walking out in the woods and he came across an old man sitting outside a village, and the old guy was sitting beside the road. He didn't have a house. He was dressed in rags and he hadn't eaten in 3 days. And the guy said, "Oh man, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm sitting here thanking the universe." The guy said, "For what?" And he said, "It supplies all my needs." The guy said, "You're nuts. You don't have a house. You're dressed in rags. You haven't eaten in 3 days. How in the world can you say that?" And the guy said, "Well, this is what I need right now." He just jumped right over these levels and went straight up to working on his spiritual growth. Now, if you do too much of that for too long, you may starve to death before you fully self-actualize. But recognizing there's two different ways to skin this cat. Well, what consciousness does, higher consciousness, is it empowers people to recognize these two paths and judiciously use them and jump back and forth between them. Remember how we said higher consciousness makes transitions easier? Well, they won't necessarily just keep slamming their head in the brick wall till the thing falls over. They may say, you know what, why don't I just walk around it, use the door. On the other hand, they can use this judiciously and not necessarily sell everything that they own and every relationship that they have and go sit out in the middle of the woods for 40 years. Okay? It makes it much easier to navigate this mountain by taking the most effective and productive route up. And it does not waste time on fruitful side ventures that aren't really going to contribute anything to self-actualization. So, what higher consciousness gives us in getting to that place of self-actualization is greater speed and efficiency. So as a recap, higher consciousness gives us more possibilities, more tools, more agility and effectiveness, and more speed and efficiency in getting to where we want to go, which is happiness and self-actualization. So I ask you, if life is viewed as a competition or a game or a race, is this a fair fight? Lower consciousness versus higher consciousness? I'm going to suggest to you that it looks something like this. Over here we've got Vern Troyer, who's not much bigger than Shaquille O'Neal's tennis shoe. And over here we've got the champ. He's got the speed, he's got the power, he's got the tools, he's got the know-how. Not anywhere close to a fair fight. That's the difference between lower consciousness and higher consciousness. Key principle number 3. Everything you want in life, you're going to have to deal with somebody to get. Think about that. Everything you want in life, you're going to have to deal with somebody to get. And for the smart Alex in the room, that's even if the someone is you. Remember who I just introduced you to? Some of the greatest roadblocks we experience as human beings come from those parts of ourselves that we have not yet assimilated. Self-defeating behaviors, blind spots. The list of problems we can create for ourselves is virtually endless. And we do it. We're really good at it. So now I want to take this and I want to step back. I've been pretty personal, pretty individual. I want to back up and now go to the middle ground between the collective consciousness and us as individuals, which is our relationships. If you look at kind of what is the focus of concern of consciousness at each of these different levels, this is just a very quick thumbnail sketch. At the instinctual level, resource acquisition. At the individualistic level, control and affirmation. Intellectual level, information, pragmatically useful information, truth, etc., etc. Does this make sense to everybody, given how we've discussed the levels of consciousness up to this point? That at each level, its consciousness is kind of going to have a different focus of interest. Okay, well, if you take that and you overlay it on top of relationships, you remember I talked about subtle energy as the Holy Grail. As we walk through this, think about what's happening at the level of subtle energy. In order for you to maintain a relationship with somebody who's functioning at the instinctual level of consciousness, you're going to have to either be an aid or a source for securing needed resources. That's what you're going to have to do to be highly valued to them. If you can't do that, you're useless to them. And if it looks like you might interfere with their ability to get that, then you're a dire threat to them, and they may take you out. If you have somebody whose consciousness is centered at the individualistic level, the cost of maintaining that relationship is you have to support their security and their ego, because at that level, personal security and security of the ego are undifferentiated typically. So you're going to have to keep their ego placated, and you're going to have to keep them secure. If you don't have their back, they got no further use for you. At the conformist level, consciousness is focused around being a good member of the tribe. I got to be in good standing because my tribe's my support system. and they shape my beliefs, and they help me understand what's good and bad and right or wrong. So I've got to be in a good position in my tribe. If you're in a very primitive society and you get booted out of the tribe, your chances of survival just took a serious hit. And your chances of prospering may have been fatally wounded. Okay. If you have an individual who's functioning at the rational level of consciousness, in order to maintain that relationship, you have to be in the right. Okay? If you're wrong too many times, they're eventually going to sever that relationship because you're just nuts. You're not thinking clearly. At the pluralistic level, and the cost of maintaining that relationship is you have to be a decent human being. You don't necessarily have to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi, but you got to be a decent human being, otherwise they won't want to be your friend. At the integral level, in order to maintain that relationship, you have to be a human being. If you've got a consciousness that's functioning at the integral level, the only price you have to pay to be on good terms with them is be a human being. Jesus, they nailed him to the cross. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. They're killing the guy. And they still did not become his enemy. Okay? And then at the transcendent level of consciousness, to remain in good standing in that relationship, all you have to do is exist. If you exist, and someone's functioning at the transcendent level of consciousness, they're going to value you and value your perspective no matter what. They may not agree with it, they may not follow it, but they will respect it. So does everybody see what's happening here? The lower you go in the levels of consciousness in a relationship, the more expensive that relationship is to maintain in terms of energetic costs. Does everybody see how that works? All right. So then we go to the next equation. Okay, well, if the relationship goes south, what happens? What's the fallout? At the instinctual level, you cross them. Physical attack is not unlikely. Theft of property, assault, murder, they're all realistic possibilities. At the individualistic level, likely reactions, if the relationship goes south, is there's going to be actively hostile behavior towards you. They may or may not physically attack you, but it's going to be hostile, and they're going to pursue vindication in some form or fashion, most likely, unless they're just too tied up with other things. At the conformist level, since it's a tribal mentality, if the relationship goes south, they're very likely to engage in gossip, slander, and try and get everybody over on their side and isolate you from any kind of support network. At the rational level, they're going to sit you down and have a conversation with you and say, okay, now look, you screwed up. Here's where you were wrong. They will try and correct you, improve you, justly reform you. At the pluralistic level, if the relationship goes south, they may have a discussion with you about it, or they may just say, you know what, we'll catch up in the next life. At the integral level, no reaction. If the relationship goes south, they're not going to react to that. With Jesus, they tried to kill him. He didn't react. Okay? Yeah. It's very much a similar dynamic. Does everybody see the same dynamic? Lower levels of consciousness, when the relationship goes bust, the price you got to pay is a lot worse. The fallout is a lot worse. So does everybody see energetically what's happening in relationships from a standpoint of consciousness? Okay. Why is raising consciousness so powerful? Where did it come from? Well, when I was little and working my way out of depression, I started reading, and like I said, I grew up in the Methodist church, so I read about this dude named Jesus, and he had all these ideas. Okay, you can't see it, sir. He had all these ideas and teachings and explanations of God and life and what we should and shouldn't do. And I thought, that dude's pretty cool. He's got some very interesting ideas. And I kept reading, and I ran across this dude named Socrates. And Socrates had all these interesting ideas, and I noticed, there's some overlap between the two of them. They talk about a few things in common, but Socrates had a lot of his own ideas too. These are two very interesting cats. And then there's this dude named Buddha. And Buddha had an area that he liked to talk about. And there's a little bit of overlap here, and some overlap with Socrates, and some overlap with Jesus. But he had a lot of his own ideas as well. And there's this dude named Patanjali. And y'all see how this is working. All these ideas, and there's many, 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 many more. But eventually the light came on for me, and I said, wait a minute. There's something that every one of these people share in common. Almost every one of the great teachers of humanity has devoted a significant portion of their teaching to how we use the mind. Consciousness. We've all heard that saying, all roads lead to the same place. Well, I submit to you that is the place. Consciousness is where all roads lead to. How accessible is this place where all roads lead? Back to this graph, if we take the numbers from the research, 1% of the world is functioning up here at the integral or transcendent level. 1%. Is it any wonder they have an advantage? More possibilities, tools, agility, effectiveness, etc., etc., etc. Great. All well and good, but how do we raise consciousness? Theories are wonderful, but if they're going to be of any value, we have to be able to use them and apply them. How do we do it? Means one, meditation. Research has shown that meditation is one of the most reliable ways of integrating the mind. That goes without saying. If there's anybody in here that's not familiar with meditation or hasn't already done it or whatever, in my book I run through a very simple garden variety form of meditation that's pretty effective. But it's not rocket science. Means two. Mind skill training. Training our minds to give us the most effective reality it can with the energy it has at its disposal. What I found as I read over years and years, and I've gone through many, many, many fields, but what I found is there's 21 skills, mind skills, that keep coming up over and over and over and over again. They show up in psychology, they show up in philosophy, they show up in religion, they show up in spirituality, the occult. Everywhere you look, these 21 keep coming up over and over. And so I've listed those out in the book, but I want to give you one example to show you why these are so powerful. Okay? Out of these top 21, I'm just going to take an egalitarian perspective. Okay, the view that in terms of worth, all people are pretty much equal. Some people take that as a moral or even a religious principle. Okay? But it is a very pragmatic rule to live by from the standpoint of consciousness, and I'll tell you why. If you do not operate by that rule, the opposite of that rule is people are not equal. Some are better than others. Okay, so then your mind has to go to work figuring out who's better and who's worse, because you want the better ones for your friends and you want to avoid the worse ones. It's just natural. If there's angels and demons, you want to side up to the angels and stay away from the demons. So the mind is doing this calculation. Well, inevitably it comes back around to, okay, well, where do I fit in this mix? So the mind will stack you up, set you beside somebody, and start making a comparison. How do I compare to them? Well, the ego wants to come out on top. Because if you're better than someone, your standing is higher in the tribe, or your chances of winning whatever the contest is are better. Natural human reaction for the ego to want to place itself on top. So one of two things will happen. And this is... Okay, I'm just going to have to get to the chase. Generally speaking, one of two things will happen. When the ego makes that comparison and then it comes to something that is uncomfortable, it's going to do one of two things. It's going to lie and say, I'm not really as bad as what most people might say I was. I have a reason for that. Grandpa did thus and such to me. Or, whatever the case may be. They may just ignore it. So if the ego is self-indulgent, it makes excuses for itself, it will find ways for it to come out on top. The logical and the subconscious says, this is how we work this equation. So it will start doing these subconscious processes where subconsciously it's giving itself extra credit, and then it starts cutting credits out from the other person. Because if you bring them down, you don't have to raise yourself up quite as far. And then both those habits get reinforced. And so the ego becomes inflated, and it begins to become very critical and judgmental of other people. And so people who go that direction tend to become egotistical and arrogant, usually covering up weaknesses. There is a huge cost to that. Huge cost. Number one, you lose objectivity. You're no longer viewing reality objectively, which means your ability to grow has been curtailed because you're not operating on reality anymore. And you may even grow in a really bad direction because you're operating on a false reality and you've bought into it. The other thing that can happen is arrogance. How many of you know people that love to have arrogant people as friends? I don't. So there's a huge social cost to splitting off in that direction. Then we have the egos that go the other way, that say, I really did screw up. I'm not that bad. I'm not that good. I wish I was better. And then it begins to become self-critical. It says, there's just no excuse for me having done that. And the subconscious says, that's how we're doing this equation. So then it looks for ways that the person is wrong. And their self-esteem goes right off the cliff. Because constantly their subconscious is kicking their feet out from under them, telling them what they did wrong, how they don't measure up. There's always somebody who's better looking. There's always somebody who's smarter. There's always somebody who's done it better than you did. Okay? The ways to beat yourself up are almost endless. And if any of you ever know anybody who's suffered from poor self-esteem, you know the energetic cost in their mind and their life is huge. It takes a tremendous toll. Okay? So this one principle, if we will adopt it and hold it in our mind, an egalitarian perspective, it avoids both those huge potential pitfalls. Huge potential consumptions and wastes of subtle energy that bring no positive benefit and cause a lot of destruction. The other 20 are in similar fashion, same kind of thing. That's why they're so powerful. The end. Okay. I've got about, 10, 15 minutes. If anybody wants to ask any questions, I probably confounded everybody. Any questions, or have I just muddled things up totally? Questions, thoughts, comments? No? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm.
Do you equate the global brain or collective human consciousness, do you equate the global brain with collective consciousness? In other words, is your book and your thought about this, does it limit consciousness to human beings, or is there any thought that non-human elements on the globe have an influence on where things are going?
Okay. That's a good question. The question, and correct me if I get this wrong, but the question as I understood it was, when I talk about the collective consciousness, am I restricting that to the band of consciousness that humans operate within, or do I view it as being even beyond human beings? Okay. The answer to your question is in the book. I just stick to the human band of experience because I think that's all most people are ready to discuss. And beyond that, you can get into some very heated debates. My own personal opinion is it expands vastly beyond that. But in terms of what I cover and focus on in the book, I pretty much confine myself to the human band of experience. Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes?
I noticed you mentioned the word happiness quite a bit, and I don't know, I don't know, you say how everybody has their own idea of what happiness is.
If I understand your question or your comment/question,
Yeah,
I think what you're getting to is, am I saying happiness is a thing to be achieved? Is that right? Or an external destination or event?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, depending on where consciousness is coming from, will influence how it answers that question. At the lower levels, yes, it typically will be viewed as something like that. At the higher levels, it typically won't. My personal opinion is it's a state of mind. It's a state of consciousness. But consciousness coming from different levels will answer that question differently.
Right.
So you kind of have to tailor If you're out talking to other people, you kind of have to tailor your discussion with where they're at. Yes, sir.
Did I get the impression that you may have studied with Don Beck in spiral dynamics?
I've read on spiral dynamics. But no, I wouldn't say I've studied with it.
Was it easy to integrate your thoughts and spiral dynamics thoughts?
Very easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting if you take spiral dynamics from the perspective of Don Beck, who's now the leading proponent of it, and then you take the Ken Wilber perspective of spiral dynamics. It's interesting because they see the same structure. My interpretation is they're looking at it from two different directions. Beck is saying that it is evolved out of society's evolution, whereas I think Wilber would say it's internal structures of consciousness. So it's the outside view looking in and the inside view looking out. I just kind of constrict myself to the structure and say, you can look at it from whichever angle you want to, but yes, it's very consistent.
Thank you.
Very consistent. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes?
I have to admit that I got lost on the very last part of your discussion up there.
Okay. At which point?
I was in the last slide, and I didn't quite get where you were going. You said, let's cut to the chase.
Mm-hmm.
And from the point that you cut to the chase, I didn't quite get it.
Okay. Okay, good. To repeat what you were saying is I kind of wandered off the road on the last slide
Well, I'm
and
not
started
saying
getting foggy.
that. I'm just saying I didn't get it.
Okay. I'll go back over it. There's 21 principles that keep coming up over and over again that say if you apply this in the way your brain works, the way your mind thinks, it can have a huge impact on your life. I took one of them as an example, which is an egalitarian perspective, which is basically the perspective we're all equal. Okay? If you hold that perspective, it's like an anchor. It's like walking down the center of the road, you might say. Once you change your assumption to people are not equal, then the consequence that typically follows from that is people typically will go one of two directions, where they become self-indulgent and their ego becomes inflated because they say, well, no, people aren't equal, and I'm better. Hitler, okay? We're better. The Aryan race is better. All those other people don't deserve to live, okay? There's all kinds of costs that go along with going in that direction. There's the social costs. People don't like being around people that are arrogant. There is the cost of you lose touch with reality. You're not able to objectively evaluate yourself and where you are in life. That cripples your ability to grow because you're not acting on reality. The other side of that road, if you fall off in the other direction, is if you suffer from poor self-esteem, whereas when you say, okay, people are not equal and most of them are better than me. And then that way of processing begins to get anchored in the subconscious, and it starts constantly looking for ways to cut you down, to cut yourself down. So what happens is, if you walk away from, or a person, I should say the universal you, if we walk away from this principle, which says that people are more or less equal, there's a high probability that we're going to wind up in one of two positions that's going to be very energetically costly. I'm not saying that everybody has to take that position. I'm not saying that's the right position. All I'm saying is from a pragmatic consciousness standpoint, if you walk off from the center of the road, you've greatly increased the odds that you're going to get into a huge energy vampire situation where all your energy a lot of energy gets non-constructively sucked out of you. And there may be times where that's the right decision, but from a consciousness perspective, the key is make the decisions that you make from an informed position, being aware of what's happening and what the likely dynamics are from your choices. In other words, there may be times where you need to go up the tree with a bobcat in it and take an axe to the bobcat, but you don't want to wander up that tree by accident. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess, let me think of, what I was thinking when I was listening to you is, it seems to me like the egalitarian perspective has the same mindset as your top two levels. So I'm wondering, if there are 21 examples, why did you choose this one? Was it to point out that this one affirms your top two levels? Or what? I just sort of was thinking about that.
I think that's, that's a good question. I'm not sure, I don't know that I put that much thought into why I picked the one I picked. I think it was just a random, I'll do this one.
Okay.
But it's a good question. Yes, sir.
Let me see if I can phrase this right. There's some that say that we're going into a higher consciousness because we're coming into a higher vibration from the galactic plane or whatever. And what you're saying is that higher consciousness is an individual thing, which is kind of what I believe. But my question is, do you see that we are actually entering into a higher individual consciousness as we progress in society
Okay.
now?
The question is, do I see us as entering into higher individual consciousnesses as the collective consciousness progresses?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I think absolutely so. For a number of reasons, we have a lot better educational tools at our disposal than we've ever had. We have a lot freer flow of information than we've ever had. And brain synchrony research has shown that usually when you put two people together, even if they're not necessarily directly interacting with each other, the brain with the more coherent brain pattern will typically influence the brain with the less coherent brain pattern. So higher consciousness from that perspective is more powerful and exerts more influence. So as more of us move up the ladder, it makes it easier for everybody to go up the ladder. We're lifting each other up. Yes?
Related question, on the list of percentages of the population that are in different groups,
Yes, ma'am.
do you have any research or thoughts on how that may or may not have changed over history?
Well, okay,
Is
the
it
question is, am I aware of anything that talks about how those levels have changed over history, those percentages? Yes. According to spiral dynamics, when they started, 100% was at level 1. And then we learned agriculture and we became a little more secure, and part of society moved up to level 2, so 100% was at level 1 and level 2. So we've gone from 100% at level 1 up to the percentages where we are now, and the trend clearly is for the percentages to keep going up. The general overall trend of human history. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested in the consciousness project that you spoke of at the very beginning. 2 questions. What did you do that facilitated people to just be relating at such a deep kind of soul level? And the second question, and related, is when it grew to 200, how were you able to continue that?
In what?
How were you able to continue the sharing at that deep soul level if you had 250 people?
Okay.
I mean,
That's a good
I
question.
understood
How did we manage, the question as I understood it was, the group that I started, how did we manage to share at such a deep level? And then with 250 people, how did we do it? There's 2 ways. One, we met in my house, which had a maximum occupancy of about 45 people. So in face-to-face personal get-togethers, it was usually between 30 and 40 people. But we did a whole lot of interacting over the internet where there was an exchange, basically running discussions that sometimes would go on for days. And people, would read them. Some people would feel interested in contributing. Some would stay out of the conversation. But it was basically a listserv. So we had 2 different ways of going about that.
And what year was this? What year did you start this?
Oh,
'Cause
goodness.
Technology has just advanced.
Yes.
Served in that.
Yes, sir. What was that, about 5 years ago? It was about 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'm really impressed with how you've gotten this stuff to a practical, it's pretty easy to see things. But there's a division that I am aware of, and that is that the spiritual leaders, the gurus, really think it's each individual person making an evolution within themselves. And yet there's this talk about this external evolutionary bump, or bump is a good word, that we're getting. Can you talk about how those two relate?
Absolutely. His question is, what's the relationship between the individual growth of consciousness and the macro growth of consciousness? Did I have that right?
That's good.
Okay. Are you familiar with the concept of a whole-on?
I don't know by that name.
A whole-on is something that exists as a whole within itself, but yet it is also a part of a larger whole. So a heart is an organ, and it's kind of an individual in and of itself, but it also makes it part of the human body. So we have this very interesting dynamic in consciousness, and my explanation of what you're talking about is basically consciousness is one thing. What you're talking about is it's flipping the glasses that it's wearing to view reality, because consciousness can view the world as an individual, and from that perspective it looks like it is individuals raising their individual consciousness to carry us forward, yet the same consciousness, if it comes at it from the universal perspective, it appears to be everything that is causing this to happen. It's two sides of the same coin. It is the same thing being viewed from two different perspectives. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Okay.
It's the only thing that makes sense to me. But when I talk to people who are at this spiritual level and who are talking about the enlightenment and the process of becoming enlightenment, there's this tendency to think there's only one way to do it, and they're the ones that got it, and it can only be one person at a time, and it doesn't make sense.
Okay, the last part, which doesn't make sense?
That there's only, this is only going one person at a time.
Okay.
That each person and only one person can get to a higher level of consciousness by themselves. But I think we're kind of all in this together regardless.
Okay. Here's the additional follow-up I would say to that, and I'm not sure I can repeat that question or comment correctly, but I think the gist of it was it doesn't seem like an adequate perspective to say that it's each individual doing their own individual thing that's carrying the world forward. It seems like there's got to be more to it than that. Okay. I think what I would say from the perspective of someone who's studied consciousness for a long, long time, the best response to that is, great, then do everything you can do as an individual to raise consciousness and let them work within the modality that they can handle. It's much easier to have them work from within the framework that they can work in than to try and introduce them to a larger framework. Gandhi did something which was really awesome. He said, and he was Hindu, and when they were, this subject of the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims would come along, he would, instead of, which most people, the universal approach almost always in history has been, if you're not my religion, you need to get with my religion, period. Gandhi didn't do that. He said, if you're Hindu, be a good Hindu. If you're a Muslim, be a good Muslim. If you're a Christian, be a good Christian. Be the best you can be at whatever it is that you are, and that is the path. And I think that's, from a consciousness standpoint, where we need to go is wherever you are, however the world looks to you, whatever glasses you have on, do the best you can from that. And I think that is the best way to channel the most energy into moving humanity collectively forward. Because if people aren't ready to jump to the next level, you can talk to them till they're blue in the face. They're not going to jump.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. It has been an honor and a pleasure.